George Osborne must be suffering from economic amnesia, say his flabbergasted critics, their heads still shaking with astonishment. His short-term memory must be shot to pieces, they proclaim, utterly impaired. Why else would he have announced two schemes in his budget that will see the government taking on the mortgage liabilities of people the banks think it's simply too risky to lend to? Why would he have done that? Has he forgotten the subprime crisis? If you recall, that involved banks, mostly American ones, getting into massive difficulties after offering mortgages to people who didn't have a cat's chance in hell of paying them back. Put bluntly, dodgy mortgage lending caused the world's financial woes. So how on earth can it be the solution? Well, the Chancellor would argue that what he's putting forward is very different. His first scheme, because there are two of them, is called Help to Buy, and it aims to assist those who can afford monthly mortgage repayments but who are struggling to get together the massive deposits many banks currently demand. Under the plans, any purchaser will only have to stump up a 5% deposit on new build houses. The government will then fund 20% of the cost of the home through a shared equity loan, interest-free for the first few years. Mr Osborne, in a second scheme, has also pledged £130 billion in mortgage guarantees. And under that scheme, prospective buyers will again contribute 5% of the value of the property. The government then guarantees another 15%, but it's a wider scheme because it will apply both to new build and older properties and is available to first-time buyers and those already on the ladder. So is this a welcome helping hand from the government, or is it economic suicide? We'll have a discussion in just a sec, but let's make sure we've got the details correct first with our political correspondent Robin Brandt, who's at Westminster. So two schemes, but very similar, Robin.
You're right, Jeremy. Effectively, in the first scheme, the Bank of George will buy with you, and that is aimed at encouraging, first-time buyers mainly who are looking for a new property. And as you say, they pass the test. The banks believe that they can and are able to repay those mortgages monthly, so the risk is lower, but they're struggling to get what is now often 20 or 30% deposits together. So the Bank of George will buy with you, shared equity to get you on the ladder. The second scheme, far more sizable. The government won't be actually putting up cash. No cash will be coming off the books. But what it is basically doing is promising to underwrite mortgages, promising to guarantee them to the tune of £130 billion. That is a much wider scheme, as you said, and carries inherently a much bigger risk because, of course, there is the chance that somewhere down the line, various people will default on those mortgages and they, together with the banks that lend to them, but also, crucially, the government will be liable for part of that default if indeed it happens.
So the government is standing behind the bank in that situation, effectively saying to the bank, you lend, don't worry, because if it goes wrong, we'll compensate you.
Yeah, what they're saying is they are kind of stepping in where perhaps some people now may rely on their mum and dad or other people perhaps in the family to guarantee the mortgage. What the Chancellor is saying on behalf of the government is that the government will step in to the tune of £130 billion and they will guarantee, they will underwrite. The first scheme actually means money coming out of the Treasury books. The second scheme doesn't mean that at the moment. What they're trying to do is to stimulate the housing market by saying to the banks there are plenty more people out there who want to buy. We know there are issues of guaranteeing those mortgages, but we will step in and try to do that. One issue that's come up this morning is the extent to which people who may want to buy a second home can benefit from either of these schemes. The government doesn't want to be seen in these very troubled times to be, subsidising rich landlords or people out there who see an opportunity to invest in a holiday home down by the seaside somewhere. So at the moment they're saying they're consulting on that. They want this to be about first-time buyers ostensibly and new properties, but at the moment they haven't been out to rule out completely the fact that this could also benefit those who are looking to buy a second home.
Interesting stuff. Thank you very much, Robin Brandt, BBC political correspondent. With us is Jonathan Davis, an economist and wealth manager, and Max Wynne Cowie, who's head of progressive conservatism at the think tank Demos. Jonathan Davis, you got doubts about this scheme?
When I watched this yesterday, I thought I'd gone back in time. It was Gordon Brown or Alistair Darling giving a budget. I think the big picture we have to understand is that budgets are not there to solve economies. They're there to buy votes. And although it may not feel like it, it was 3 years ago that we had the general election. It's only 2 years till the next one. So what the Chancellor, the government is doing is he's building a financial war chest to buy votes in the next couple of years. And secondly, he's building a positive war chest. In other words, a positive feeling. There's no doubt that these housing schemes are going to be big vote winners. But economically, our children are going to be paying for this so big, because we're already spending £50 billion a year just on interest as we build up the debt to gargantuan sums. Do you realise that in a decade how much we'll be spending just on interest, how much we won't be spending on pensions, on health, on the welfare state? That's what this kind of process is going to create.
Maxwell Cowie, it's more government debt, effectively.
It's not government debt. What the Chancellor is doing is using the confidence that's been built up in the state's finances in order to help to spread home ownership to people who are perfectly capable of paying a mortgage. They're already paying hugely inflated rents month after month after month, but as you say, find it impossible because of the economic situation that we're in to build up the level of an asset that banks are now asking for. Banks are being irrationally cautious about lending for mortgages.
Do you think they are? Because they, remember what happened. It wasn't that long ago. They were offering 100, 110% mortgages, and they didn't just get their fingers burnt; they were destroyed by that.
And this is, and to be really clear, this is not a return to the kind of 125% Northern Rock mortgages. And what it also is not, and I think this is really crucial, is a get out of jail free card for people in the way that kind of self-assessed mortgages used to be, where you'd turn up and you'd say, well, I'm self-employed and I think I earn this much money, and the bank would never bother to check that. Put in place in here are safeguards to ensure that the lending is responsible in terms of people's ability to pay it back. And it's worth noting, actually, we're talking about 25% deposits for houses. In London, the average deposit is over £100,000 now. Most people who are buying houses do not save that money. It comes either from their parents or it comes from previous assets. So this is not about giving money to people who are irresponsible, giving mortgages to people who are irresponsible. It's about saying, actually, for a lot of people who don't have parents who are going to be able to give them 50 grand in order to get them started on the housing ladder, it's really important that we find ways of helping them to meet their aspirations.
Jonathan, what's wrong with, leaving aside the idea that it adds to the debt, which I know concerns you, what's wrong with the government going in with the bank, alongside the bank, and helping people?
Well, it's yet another prop to house prices. It may have a marginal effect on the market. Remember, the market is collapsed. It's down 50% from 5 or 6 years ago. Ask any estate agent.
In some parts of the country,
including in London and the southeast, the number of sales is down 40 to 50% in the southeast and London, as it happens, although prices clearly have not fallen. The market has collapsed. Clearly, a lot of people who are paying a lot of rent right now will take this up. And yes, it will be a short-term prop to house prices. And that is the really dangerous thing, because you take Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who are finding it difficult, blah, blah, blah. They will take on this. They will take on the debt. You ask, what's wrong with this? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with this. There is an assumption. There are two assumptions. One, there is not going to be a global recession. Well, that's a funny thing, because China's teetering a recession. The EU is in depression. The UK, 0.6% growth. Believe me, that's as good as recession, unfortunately. The US is about to go back into recession.
Okay.
80%. Second assumption is that interest rates will never rise. So the people taking out these vast borrowings will always be okay. Nothing could be further from the truth. Interest rates are at a 300-year low. There's only one direction they can go in due course.
It's interesting. Go on, Max, do you want to talk?
Well, no, I mean, I think there are some really valid points there, and we need to factor in terms of that assessment process for people who are taking up these schemes, their ability to not just pay on today's interest rates, but their ability to pay within a reasonable spectrum.
It won't happen.
And that's part of what it is that the Treasury has tried to build into it. I mean, I would just say, you're absolutely right that the housing market is incredibly kind of static at the moment.
Overvalued?
And that's a real... Well, I mean, I disagree with Jonathan about whether or not the housing market is completely overvalued. In some areas, clearly it is, etc. But, actually, the value of homes is not...
I was just going to say, Max, you were saying people need to give on average a deposit of £100,000
in London
to buy their first property. It's got to be overvalued, hasn't it?
Well, I'm not sure in what way you would say that means it's got to be overvalued. I mean, that is the price of homes in London.
Because ordinary people can't afford to buy a house.
Well, indeed, and that's why we need to be finding ways to help people onto that ladder. But I would say it helps no one if people are unable to sell their homes as well. There's 190,000 people in this country who are stuck in so-called zombie mortgages, which means that they're stuck in a house which they don't want to be in. They've got people who have had to turn down job opportunities. It's a barrier to social mobility. This is a real problem in the British housing market, and Jonathan's right that is problematic. And this scheme will help. Both of these schemes will help to promote a bit more kind of movement and liquidity within the market. And that's going to be good for people both coming into the market, but also people who are already there and have become stuck.
It does get people on the ladder, Jonathan.
I've heard this phrase, housing ladder, 3 times in the last 10 minutes from each of you, as well as the chap who was from Westminster. It is not a housing ladder. It's a housing ladder when 20 years ago the average price was 35,000. When the average price is 220,000, it is no longer a ladder. We're at the summit. It is now a snake. That's the point. And like Bill Clinton did in the 90s and then was continued in the 2000s, we have a situation here where there are government loans to anyone who wants to buy a house. What does buy a house, by the way? Let me finish. What does buy a house mean? It means taking out a vast debt. We're not talking about buying houses. What happened was with the American situation is that they kept on doubling down, lending to everyone and anyone until eventually the thing collapsed. And that's what will happen here, because interest rates in due course will rise and there will be a global recession.
Subprime all over again.
Well, it absolutely isn't. The problem that was caused by subprime is a problem of not properly assessing whether or not people are able to repay. It is not a problem caused by whether or not people have been able over the last kind of 5 years to save for themselves £100,000, which almost nobody does at the moment anyway. This is about helping those people who don't have mum and dad to step in and help them, but who are earning good money and are responsible creditors.
Thank you both very much. Really interesting territory. Max Wynne-Cowie, head of progressive conservatism at the famous think tank Demos, and Jonathan Davis, economist and wealth manager, very doubtful about this scheme.